Thank you so much for joining this virtual webinar series titled The Elephant at the Table, where we are exploring how power inequities in food systems undermine the sustainability of food. Food systems are shaped by power: who controls the resources, who sets the rules, and whose interests are protected. And when power is ignored, efforts to improve food system sustainability often remain marginal. In this series, we're examining how meaningful food system transformation depends on confronting power directly. This series draws on a year-long collaboration led by Jose Luis Chicoma while in residency as program chair for this project at the New Institute in Hamburg, Germany. This collaboration involved 8 scholars and practitioners who developed food policy recommendations to confront power across various and diverse sectors of the food system, including agroecology, fisheries, seeds, affordable diets, and governance. This series covers 8 topics as listed on this slide. Today's session is Chapter 5. It's focused on harnessing biodiversity, neglected and underutilized species as drivers of structural transformation. This series is hosted by the New Institute, Food and Planet, and the Food and Social Justice Action Research Lab at the New School. Today's session is co-sponsored by the Alliance of Biodiversity International and CIAT, whom they are doing incredible and critical work on agrobiodiversity and equitable food systems. A special thank you to the events and communication staff, the IT staff, and Cedric Gottfried, the PhD candidate in public health and urban policy at the New School, for their assistance in running this webinar series and the future series as well. I would now like to introduce our incredible speakers and panelists. Today's presenter is Emma McDonald. She is an assistant professor of anthropology at the University of Tennessee at Chattanooga. She's also the author of The Quinoa Bust. Emma is a fellow, New Institute fellow. I spent some time, many months with her in Hamburg, Germany, and she is an incredible researcher. And her chapter is focused on today's topic, biodiversity and power. More specifically, how we can harness biodiversity and neglected and underutilized species as drivers of structural transformation. Our co-hosts and commentators today are Celine Tormota, a senior scientist and African regional team leader for the food, environment, and consumer behavior at Alliance of Biodiversity International and CIAT. Celine is based in Nairobi, and she leads a multidisciplinary team across multiple African countries, bridging ethnobotany, agroecology, food environments, and diet quality. We're also here from Jenny Gayo. She is a postdoctoral fellow at the Alliance of Biodiversity International and CIAT, where she leads the application of multi-omics technologies to understand the molecular diversity and nutritional quality of foods. She also plays a key role at the Periodic Table of Foods initiative, generating data sets that illuminate edible biodiversity for human and planetary health. During this presentation, please feel free to drop your questions in the Q&A box, and we will do our best to address them during the Q&A portion. As a reminder, these video sessions will be recorded and posted at a later date. Thank you for joining, and now I will hand it over to Emma.
So welcome everyone, and thank you for being here. So today I'm going to present some key takeaways from my chapter, The Elephant at the Table. This chapter broadly is about centering power in how we think about and build policy surrounding neglected species. And with that, working to position neglected species as drivers of structural transformations in food systems. So at this point, there's really a tremendous amount of agreement that neglected species offer potential for building more sustainable and resilient food systems, for increasing dietary diversity in culturally relevant ways, and for adapting to climate change. So I won't spend much time trying to convince you that neglected species matter, because I think many of you are already convinced of this. So instead, what I want to do is focus on repositioning how we think about neglected species to foreground the power obstacles that keep them marginalized, even in the face of growing recognition of their value. And of course, as all of the sessions in this webinar series do, I will point to some concrete policy levers that can make this possible. So as Chris mentioned, I spent a lot of time trying to understand the complexities surrounding one crop in particular, quinoa. which historically was considered a neglected crop, but of course today few would consider it one. And I think the quinoa case is an important one for us to be thinking about as we consider the most pressing challenges surrounding neglected species today. So I will be circling back to quinoa a few times during the presentation. And I also want to note before diving in that I'm going to abbreviate the term neglected and underutilized species with the acronym NUS. So here's an overview of what I'll be speaking on today. So I'm going to start by introducing the history of the concept of NUS. So the concept of the neglected species first develops in the 1970s as one of several alternative agricultural development paradigms emerging at the time that critique the Green Revolution in different ways. So these early neglected species advocates were development practitioners and researchers who were growing concerned about the risks of increasingly monocultural production systems, and with that, a global food supply that relied on fewer and fewer species. So this volume pictured here was the first effort to elaborate the neglected species concept. It was published by the US National Academy of Sciences in 1975. And in it, the authors warned that the world's reliance on just a few crops was begging disaster. And they urged researchers to turn their attention to the many so-called little-known plant species that scientists had barely studied. You can see here in the table of contents the species that they selected as representatives of neglected species. It's important to note that these species already had researcher advocates within their countries of origin. And so what this concept did was create a language for lumping together species as diverse as amaranth and durian fruit, which on the surface have basically nothing in common agronomically or otherwise. I think it's also important to note that this can be seen as an example of what we might today call North-South collaboration, as the contributors were really from all across the world. I also want to point out that not all of these species, but a handful of them that are mentioned in the table of contents are marketed today in upscale supermarkets as superfoods. So as you can see from this quote on the first page of that volume, they were explicitly critical of the politics of scientific knowledge production, and especially how the vast majority of agricultural research funding had focused on just a handful of crops. So in some sense, the ways that power shapes food systems was already embedded in the NUS framing from the very beginning. So for these folks, the same agricultural systems that the Green Revolution was destroying in the name of progress contain the key to feeding a growing global population. So indigenous farming landscapes were not primitive vestiges of a bygone era, but were actually critical reservoirs of so-called underexploited plants. A couple of things to note is first that the early neglected species advocacy was, of course, progressive in challenging taken for granted ideas about agricultural development at the time. And at the same time, it was not calling for an overhaul of the existing agricultural research and development apparatus, but instead incorporating more species into its ambit. So according to this framing, what the species lacked to fulfill their potential was scientific research, more studies, more attention from plant breeders, more interest from ag input companies. And the second thing I want to touch on is that this idea of the neglected species remains at the fringes in agricultural development for decades. So while there were a growing number of people that were thinking about their work through this lens in the 80s and into the 90s, they really struggled to find funding or institutional support for this work. So there is no single agreed upon definition of NUS, nor is there a clear boundary as to which species do or do not count. But in short, there are species that have received little attention from researchers, from development initiatives, and policymakers when compared to major commodity crops. Often, these species have impressive nutritional profiles, and they thrive in harsh environments, marginal soils, low input agricultural systems. And in many cases, they're quite culturally significant and are embedded in local agroecologies. Over the years, there have been many different terms used to refer to a really similar suite of species, as you can see here. So NUS is not an objective category, but it's a position defined against the conventional staple crop. So in some sense, it's simply the foil of the conventional crop which itself is, of course, shaped by histories of colonialism, of crop promotion, development paradigms, funding priorities, and the rise of a global food industry that's based on logics of capital accumulation and standardization that ultimately require the exclusion and marginalization of other crops. So their defining feature is really a sense of their unrealized potential, agronomic, nutritional, and economic, which raises some important questions about potential for what and potential for who. And this is something that I'll circle back to in a few moments. So fast forward a few decades, and noose today is no longer a fringe idea. And even some of the same agencies that underwrote the Green Revolution are now spearheading noose initiatives. And of course, this is exciting to see support for these kinds of crops that have long been marginalized. At the same time, we've seen many agricultural development miracle crops go in and out of vogue over the decades. We can think of Norman Borlaug's dwarf wheats or golden rice as purported miracle crops of earlier development paradigms, insofar as they were pitched as panaceas of sorts and also reflected and even legitimized the dominant development models and concerns at the time. And some scholars argue that these sorts of miracle crops can depoliticize issues like global hunger by focusing our attention on a sort of cure or what appears like a simple silver bullet solution while distracting us from more pressing and challenging questions of why people are undernourished in the first place. And so today, when issues like climate change adaptation, biodiversity loss, and indigenous knowledge are front and center in development priorities, which of course I think many of us agree is a good thing, I think it's also not far-fetched to argue that noose are positioned as a sort of miracle crop of the 2020s. And I don't mean to make a simple equivalency between noose and golden rice. Obviously, there are many important differences, but I also think that this should give us pause and push us to reflect on how noose can be either incorporated into existing agricultural development apparatuses in ways that don't fundamentally challenge them, or could be positioned as drivers of structural transformation of those systems. And I think that this tension is really fundamental to how we think about noose today. So this increased support for noose raises concerns about commercialization, elite appropriation, biopiracy, co-optation, and the risk of marginalizing the traditional growers of the species in question. So in this report, we argue that an overly technical approach to noose combined with contradictory visions of the future of these species can undermine their far-reaching potential. So now I'm going to touch on some drivers of marginalization. So many of the drivers of the marginalization of these species are quite well established, and some have been covered in previous webinars in this series on dietary diversity and traditional markets. So by and large, it's the same factors that have driven a very small number of crops to play dramatically outsized roles in our food systems that have marginalized and undermined these species. And similarly, the same factors that undermine small-scale agroecological farming in general undermine noose. So again, they're sort of the inverse of the conventional crop. So many of these dynamics are likely familiar to us. So subsidies and financial incentives that support stable crop production, powerful lobbies that advocate for those kinds of policies, processing innovation that focuses on scaling up staple crop processing. We see supply chains that require extreme uniformity. The kinds of places where noose tend to be sold are often undersupported and under-resourced. Many noose also have negative social perceptions and stigma attached to them. A couple of things that I want to emphasize is one, this last point, that there's ultimately money to be made in marginalizing noose, that private industry has benefited from their marginalization because it ultimately creates new consumers for ultra-processed foods and also for ag inputs. But more important is that these crops are neglected because the people who produce and consume them have been neglected. So the communities that cultivate noose tend to be among the world's most marginalized, socially, economically, and politically. These crops are primarily grown by smallholder farmers, who are often women, often indigenous groups, or other kinds of ethnic minorities. Many of them have been pushed onto marginal lands due to historical land dispossession and even contemporary land grabbing processes. So noose persists today because these communities have sustained them despite limited access to land, water, infrastructure, credit, and political representation. So, with that, efforts to mainstream these crops without addressing the resource and power inequities these producers face risk both failing the farmers, and they're likely to reproduce some of the same dynamics that noose advocates seek to challenge. And I think that it's really important that we don't lose sight of that. So I'm now going to touch on some key challenges and paradoxes that define noose today. I want to circle back to this question of potential for what and potential for whom. So noose are defined around an unrealized potential, and often noose-focused policies and initiatives focus on mainstreaming or scaling up. But all of this is rather vague and raises the question of scaling up for whom, mainstreaming where, potential for what. And even in the earliest noose reports, we see many different proposals about the proper future of these species. So the vagueness of the concept can allow lots of different actors with different agendas and visions of the future of these species to collaborate under the umbrella of realizing the potential of the species. But sometimes these aims are quite distinct and even incompatible. This is something that became really clear in my research on quinoa. So while some quinoa advocates saw quinoa as a future agro-export that would help alleviate rural poverty in the Andes, others envisioned it as solving malnutrition in the Andes. There was still another group that saw it primarily as a global scale malnutrition palliative that should be produced globally. And then finally, as climate change became a more pressing concern, for some, quinoa came to be seen as a climate change adaptation crop that could be integrated into arid environments across the world where existing crop portfolios were failing. But it became really clear during the quinoa boom that these were incompatible futures, because when quinoa's price skyrocketed, that was great for farmers who were finally making good incomes from quinoa. But it was bad for quinoa's role in local diets as it became inaccessible to under-resourced communities in the Andes. So for it to fulfill a potential of alleviating malnutrition, the price needed to be low. But for it to alleviate rural poverty, the price needed to be high. And this was a really key paradox that I'll return to in a few minutes when I talk about the policy recommendations. I also want to point out that quinoa's popularity among wealthy, health-conscious eaters did offer income opportunities for traditional quinoa growers, but that there are not protections preventing others from taking up quinoa production outside the Andean highlands where the crop is native. So quinoa is now produced all across the world, and during the quinoa boom, agribusinesses along Peru's coast, which previously did not have a history of cultivating quinoa, took up quinoa production, and they far outcompeted highland farmers on yields. So a pretty good quinoa yield in the Peruvian highlands is around 1,000 kilograms per hectare. Some coastal producers who were able to do 2 harvests a year because of the very temperate climate there were boasting up to 7,000 kilograms per hectare. So this has to do with this kind of idea of noose as substitutable. When we see it narrowly as a crop, disembedded from social, political, and agroecological context. So we need to be careful about this issue of scalability and sort of scalability for what, for who, because as we know, the industrial agriculture model is completely built around scalability and substitutability. And we don't want to just replicate those same dynamics while substituting slightly more nutritious or more hardy new species. So adding to this issue of the vagueness of potential is that we too often see a dominant approach to noose that is technical in nature, meaning that it focuses on identifying and addressing discrete agronomic variables, discrete agronomic and economic hurdles to scaling up production and consumption. So often we see a focus on problems with the crop itself or the supply chain, imagined narrowly. So for instance, news compendiums often list specific agronomic problems limiting each species, like low yields, and call on plant breeders to develop improved versions. We see more efforts to sequence the genomes of neglected species and isolate genes within them, as pictured here in this article about quinoa's genome, which was sequenced in 2017. And these technical challenges are real because there has been less funding for research and innovation on these species. It's true that we often don't have very good processing equipment, for instance, for noose. It's not that these technical challenges are sort of made up or fictional. But an overly technical approach can limit our vision and can isolate the crop from the social and political conditions of production and consumption. And this can keep us focused on these discrete obstacles to overcome rather than the structural dynamics that marginalize the crop along with the producers and eaters in the first place. So at the same time, this focus on the crop itself can lead to a sense that the crop is a sort of substitutable entity or substitutable commodity and isolate it from the agroecology in which it's embedded. So incorporating news into the dominant apparatuses for seed research and marketing is likely to entangle these so-called improved noose varieties into intellectual property considerations, which may undermine their ability to benefit noose eaters and noose growers. So broadly, framing noose as technical solutions without addressing the power structures that have marginalized the farmers and eaters who rely on them will likely produce some of these same power inequities all over again. So we now see an increasingly common trajectory from neglected species to superfood. And the dynamics I just mentioned around the vagueness of potential and the technical approaches to promoting news really enable this. So quinoa is probably the most obvious example, but I know that at my local Whole Foods, I can get a bag of fonio, teff, maca, and the supplements aisle has a whole plethora of products that are based in species that were historically considered to be noose. And this is really a defining paradox for noose today, I think. And that is that under-resourced populations that historically relied on this species produce and consume less of them in many, but not all contexts. While at the same time, we see the rise of export-focused supply chains for some of these same species that end up in the diets of healthy or wealthy, health-conscious consumers in the global north primarily. So often this is pitched as a win-win. Farmers get to keep growing their ancestral crops and also make better incomes. But the pattern we see is more complex than that and does not necessarily end up primarily benefiting the under-resourced farmers who had long produced the crop. And in some cases, the export markets undermine access for local under-resourced eaters. But this vision of the future of noose has a lot of economic and political power behind it. And while national level policies have tended to undermine noose overall and instead bolster conventional staples and export crops, we now see the rise in some contexts of policies that seek to support noose insofar as they have potential as high value superfood exports. So for example, Peru's Ministry of Exterior Commerce launched the Superfoods Peru program in 2017 as part of an effort to promote the repackaging and export of various native Peruvian superfoods, including, but definitely not limited to, quinoa. And during the quinoa boom, Peru's Ministry of Agriculture put funding into developing quinoa production along the coast, as I mentioned earlier, and even pitched this as a form of climate change adaptation, part because in some cases it was replacing water-intensive rice production. Oops. Oh, yep. So, in fact, the growing interest in noose among agronomic research and food scientists has already resulted in thousands of patents and various biopiracy cases. So, research from 2022 shows that patents and intellectual property formations related to Andean noose are overwhelmingly registered in non-Andean countries. We've seen biopiracy accusations and lawsuits related to quinoa, teff, rooibos, and hoodia, both for seeds and for processing techniques. And framing Noose initiatives around technical obstacles enabled this, and in some sense folds them into ongoing processes of enclosure that can undermine their ability to serve traditional producers and consumers. So I now want to pivot to talking about our vision for the future of Noose and some policy recommendations. So we want to be clear that we think that we must avoid the tendency towards converting Noose into superfood exports, but we're also sympathetic to the fact that farmers often see that route as attractive because it promises better incomes. So our vision is that Noose are not seen primarily as prospective high-value export commodities, but instead as essential aspects of regional food systems that offer nutritious and culturally meaningful food, while also helping build more robust and sustainable agricultural systems. So with this in mind, we have to both make Noose affordable and available to those who need them most, while also offering farmers a fair price. So in the report, there are 9 recommendations in this chapter, but I'm just going to touch on 4 today. You can follow up and read the report if you'd like to for the remaining recommendations. So first is circling back to this issue of Noose being marginalized and neglected because the farmers and eaters are marginalized and neglected. So we have to figure out what the resources the farmers need are, and in many cases, they've been systematically excluded from. So this obviously varies a lot from case to case, but this could be high quality land or irrigation or harvesting technologies. And with that, we need to support collective action through cooperatives and farmer associations so that they can demand these things themselves. So, right, Noose don't have well-funded lobbying agencies, but building collective power among producers can help give them a voice to advocate for their needs more effectively. We also need to direct state investment away from export-oriented agriculture and towards domestic supplies of Noose through subsidies and state procurement programs. And there's some really exciting and hopeful cases with Brazil's school feeding program, for instance. There's the public procurement of millets in India. And these kinds of programs can help resolve this issue of needing prices to be low so that the food remains accessible for all eaters, but also needing farmers to earn a decent living. So state procurement can help keep prices stable, while subsidies could ensure farmers are incentivized to produce these species rather than conventional staples. While the subsidies can also keep the prices of Noose low and help them compete with cheap processed alternatives. We also need to resist the impulse to focus myopically on formalization of supply chains and on supply chains that end up in supermarkets. So instead, most Noose today are available in informal or traditional markets, which, as we learned about in last week's webinar, they tend to be very under-resourced and receive little to no support for things like infrastructure, refrigeration, etc. So we need to focus on supporting the informal vendors and markets that is already making these foods available to under-resourced populations, but that have been systematically under-supported and undermined. The last recommendation that I'll touch on has to do with ideas about quality. So one issue common to many Noose is that they have incredible intra-species diversity, which is of course great, but it's also a challenge for scaling up and for processing in many cases. So for instance, for quinoa, there are hundreds of varieties of quinoa with different agronomic characteristics, but also different grain sizes, different saponin layers, and this creates challenges for processing. So only a few of them have come to be seen as commercial varieties. And in fact, these commercial varieties tend to be the least resilient because of the saponin layer that deters pests on quinoa is also very inconvenient for processing and for processors. So the commercial varieties tend to have minimal saponin. So we don't want to create monocultures with just a new set of species. We need to be careful with the relationships between scaling up and agrobiodiversity loss. And part of that has to take place with carefully designed quality standards where farmers' voices are central to the process of developing the quality standards. So as I said, these are 4 of the 9 recommendations, and the rest are available in the full report. So to close, I just want to hit on 3 takeaways. The first one we probably all agreed on at the outset, and that is that neglected species are critical for resilient, nutritious, and culturally grounded food systems, but they remain marginalized by dominant agricultural models. Second is that technical solutions alone are insufficient because the neglect of news is fundamentally a power and equity issue. And then finally, transformative policy has to center community power, public investment, and local food security rather than export-led commercialization. Okay, thank you for your attention. And with that, I will pass it to Celine Termota.
Thank you very much, Emma. This was an amazing presentation, I think, and we can't agree more that there's a lot of potential that these new species have to contribute to food system sustainability, livelihoods, and diets. But how do we do that? Like in a way that's not too technical, or focusing too much on export of specialty crops or whatsoever, so that we will also make sure that the communities that have been preserving these new species for centuries are not the ones at the end losing out, right? So I'd like to especially link with the recommendations and takeaways that you've been presenting, give a few examples of work also that we've been doing at Alliance of Biodiversity and SEAT. And usually when we start our work, we really start from diets. We have developed over the years a methodology whereby we kind of, first of all, look at like what are the current diets and what are the gaps in these diets of these local communities. Simultaneously, we kind of document all edible biodiversity that is available in those communities. So then we use this data basically to support the communities in co-creating some actions or I don't like to call them interventions or innovations. It are like rather community action plans, and we have like developed a series of 6 workshops whereby the communities go through this information and develop their own community action plans. Now in Kenya, for example, it turns out that many of these communities, wherever we worked, they really wanted to focus on traditional leafy vegetables to kind of then support their diets and improve dietary quality. In itself, the co-creation process, I think, works really empowering for the communities. We often get like people looking at this, you're not coming to tell us what to do, but we really guide the process, facilitate the process for communities to come up, like how can they make better use of the available biodiversity in their community to support diets. And then we support that also with a lot of nutrition education and awareness raising about the importance of healthy diets and so on. Again, working with local community health volunteers, the local health system, etc. And through the years, having worked in many different contexts, all the way from tropical rainforest, Western Kenya, up till Northern Kenya, where it's very dry and harsh, we have kind of been able to gather evidence that really promoting farm diversification with news and making the best use of agricultural biodiversity is really able to significantly improve local diet quality. So our focus is always diets first. Now, while doing that work, we kind of also immediately hit a major bottleneck, and I think that's also one of the chapters in the book, and that is access to basically quality seeds for this news. People, for example, in Kenya, they would go to the local market. They have to buy these seeds under the table because our seed laws in Kenya still do not allow the sales of non-certified seeds. And that's something I will come back to in a second. So people buy these seeds under the table, they come home, they try to sow, and it's not germinating, or it's not the right variety, or not even the right species. So it's a real problem. And that's where, again, through working with the community, that the idea of a community seed bank came up as a way to support like the local seed system and bring quality basically in that local seed system. Now, you can also work on seed hubs or community seed networks or whatsoever. The term is not so very important, but it's very different than saying like the solution is breeding, whereby they will focus mainly like on developing maybe one super variety, while here our objective is to conserve and promote the use of as many varieties as possible in these community seed banks. We also allow these varieties to keep developing with changing climate or changing context, etc. So that's some of the work we also do, because and then moving forward, our idea is really to have these community seed banks registered under the National Gene Bank as plant genetic resources. But then we still also want these seeds to be multiplied by the communities, and we still call in, for example, the KEFIs, which is the body in Kenya that regulates the seed sector in Kenya, because we want them to kind of certify the multiplication. Otherwise, anybody can just stand up and start selling seeds, and then you again have the issue about like, okay, there's lack of quality, it's not germinating, etc., etc. In the meantime, we are working with these community seed banks, training custodian farmers to do this seed multiplication, also in terms of seed conservation, testing also in terms of germination testing, for example. And we also support communities in developing seed catalogs, because that's a way, if everything is properly documented, we know that we can also try to protect the intellectual property of these varieties and these news, for example, because it has been documented in a seed catalog. And this seed catalog then can also support them when they start giving out seeds and so on. But right now, farmers can only exchange seeds. They are not allowed to sell them, because our Kenyan Seed, Plants and Variety Act still does not allow the sales. So we are still also having policy scientists working on the amendments of the act. And maybe one of the things where we can say that power slightly starts to shift slowly is where towards the end of last year, when the farmers basically won a court case in Kenya, saying that this Kenya Seed, Plants and Variety Act is against the constitutional law in Kenya, and they won the case. So that also gives, again, openings for us to keep working on amendments and actually working towards something as quality declared seeds, whereby our seeds would be 80% pure, our seeds would continue to adapt to changing context and climates, and then find ways how to cooperate also with the National Gene Bank to foster linkages between in situ and ex situ conservation of all this diversity, basically. Enough about seeds. Something else we are trying to support, and which you also try to bring up, is we are trying to support MSMEs for small-scale processing. As you said, some standardization, uniformity is often needed, like for the machines to work, etc., during processing. But a big question is like, how do we preserve also that diversity through the processing all the way to the plates? And just last week, we were in a workshop also with Jenny, and there were some organizations wanting to promote, for example, the finger millet value chain. Finger millet is a nuss, tiny grain in Kenya with very interesting health characteristics as well. And the organization went in the first place, they thought like, we need to find the market. If we want to promote, we need a market. And so they went to Unilever. And so Unilever is processing into porridges, all types of stuff. And they kind of agreed with Unilever on the volumes they needed, and even they set some prices that they would pay. Now, this price was a bit of an issue, because the price was like about 30% under the prevailing market price. And obviously, the organization was very successful in promoting finger millet, distributing the seeds, training the farmers. But when it came to marketing, obviously, they ran to the local market because the price was higher. And I think my point here is like that maybe we should indeed not look at these huge markets, because we are working with small-scale farmers. And these small-scale farmers, they cannot benefit of the economies of scale that are needed to produce at that large volumes, and then you can maybe accept a little lower price. So even when you tell the farmers to aggregate their produce so that they have better bargaining power to find better markets, it's with the idea they would get a better price, not that they would get a lower price, right? So this is also like, I think, a very interesting example that brings us back to the work we are trying to do, and it's really trying to support small-scale local processing, which would also allow us to keep the diversity within the value chain, because one processor might focus on these and the other one on something else, and support shorter, basically local value chains, fueling local markets and generating local profits. And another thing that's closely related to the previous point is that the value chains for these new species are often poorly coordinated. So giving another example, for example, from northern Benin, we have the fonio. You showed it on your slide, just grown in that tiny belt in West Africa. Very interesting health characteristics again. But in a workshop there, the participants literally said, our government is not interested in coordinating this value chain the way they do, for example, for cotton or many other species. And why? Because this species is locally adapted, but doesn't need inputs. And so there were no deals to be made with the input providers or whatsoever. So local government was not interested in supporting the coordination of this local fonio value chain. This now leads to many small actors doing many tiny different things without coordination, leading to misinformation, distrust, farmers fighting with processors, processors with vendors, etc., etc. Lots of confusion. And so at Alliance, what we're trying to do is to strengthen and or set up, where necessary, multi-stakeholder platforms whereby different value chain actors can actually come together and discuss, and they can start to get to know each other better. They can start to discuss what do they know, what do they need, what does the other one know, what does the other one need, and so on. And that is basically needed because for many times you need many different actors coming together to actually develop a business deal. For example, a farmer might want to supply a school, but would need to invest into off-season production to cover the dry season or the period where there's less of this, especially with vegetables available. Then he needs capital from the bank, but then to access that, he needs insurance and maybe the backup from the government because they need to have the guarantees that this business deal would work, etc., etc. So really working on bringing different stakeholders in the value chain together so that all these things could be discussed and that we can work towards better information flow also in the value chain. We're also looking at digital tools whereby we can make information such as price, volumes, quality that is needed better available. And then my last point, to promote diversity and to keep the diversity, we've been working also on supporting policy. For example, a nice example is the agroecology policy in Vihiga County that Alliance has been supporting. This policy explicitly refers to news and also the opportunity of procurement with schools, etc., contributing also to better diets and nutrition. A very nice multi-sectoral policy spanning agriculture, environment, as well as health. And to me, this is the type of policies that can really support agriculture diversification and integration of news without focusing too much on one particular species for export or whatsoever. But of course, there's still a lot of bottlenecks despite our nice policies. We need a bit of better alignment because Kenya still focuses a lot, for example, on maize subsidies. There's still also a lot of issues in terms of getting these nice policies financed. Procurement systems are way too complicated for our local farmers. They often have to wait a year for being paid for delivering nutritious news, etc. And I think to close, one of the main things that I and my team would like to look further, and it's like looking into these financing issues. While actual finance is often going to major crops, etc., but trying to better understand how that works, and to then develop the arguments as to why biodiversity, news, and all these things within a broader food systems perspective actually would need to be financed as well. And that's where I fully agree also with the overall report making these statements that we should actually not try to push news within the mainstream system, but how can we rather redesign our food systems for more inclusivity? I'll stop here in the interest of time. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Celine, for those fantastic and inspiring comments. So we will pass it to Jenny Gaio now.
Hello. Hello, Emma. Hello, everybody. So it was a really nice presentation, and thank you, Celine, for all the amazing comments. I think you already covered a lot of the work that we have been doing at the Alliance, but I want to focus the next minutes in maybe changing a little bit of the perspective about this work that you've been doing, Emma. And it's like, I totally agree, right? We all know that these crops has a big regional value. It's all about culture. And I've been talking with these people, and I'm really, really excited about the way that they explain these crops, right? But then my point, or the best point for me about your arguments, is these participatory quality standards. We need politics, right? But then if we want to move to that, we need, this is the main point that I want to talk to you, we need evidence. And I want to talk about data-driven evidence. And maybe because I'm working from the food composition way of thinking, right? So we need to understand what is actually in this news. And I want to highlight the way that sometimes these crops are popularized, right? Like this quinoa or this crop is the superfood. But what is actually true about that? What do we actually know about that crops, right? Which is the data that we are using to generate these changes to generate these politics. And let's think for a moment about all these crops sometimes are not included in food composition databases. So we are talking about generating diet guidelines, right? To generate strategies to promote the consumption of these crops, to work with the communities. But we can do that if we don't have the data to include these foods into a database, if we cannot generate a dietary guideline for start thinking about policy, about how the government, the different officers can help us to promote these crops, right? And then because I'm working with the Periodic Table of Food Initiative, we have been working with these communities. I'm right now working in these 7 countries here in Africa to really understand what the communities want to understand about these news. And there's a lot to discuss with them. They really know what they want to know. Like, hey, what happened if I do this processing to the crop? And they are really concerned about the community and how to promote inside the community. So I think it's really important that we can think about that point. But again, there are always 2 versions of the story, right? So right now I'm thinking like it could be great to have all these data, and because I'm working with PTFI, the Periodic Table of Food Initiative, so standardized data that can be included in global databases that we can compare, that can be integrated, and we can really like position these crops into the world scenario and guidelines, right? But what about the other side of the story? Who, and just using the same sentence that you use, Emma, so data for what and data for whom, right? So we will be generating all this amazing data, but again, are we contributing to make the problem bigger? So who will be the owner of this data? Who will be taking more advantage of all this high quality data that we are generating? So yes, data, and specifically thinking about omics data, is really key, I will say, if we really want to promote. Of course, we need other data, right? But just from my case, I wanna focus on this compositional data. So yeah, we need that. We need this quality data, standardized data, omics data that can let us know exactly which are the biomolecules that we can find in these crops that can be promoted and can improve the consumption and can help the different communities to really take advantage of this, right? But then who will be the owner of this data? I want to talk a little bit about this because I really think that if we want to promote news in some way, we need to be always thinking about ABS, access and benefit sharing. We have to talk about capacity building. We have to talk about community engagement in all the different processes of this story. So from PTFI, we are creating an ecosystem of people working in different countries. Each country will be working with their own local foods, with the different crop species. And always we really want to, we are starting like to promote more and more the inclusion of these communities in each of the process. So for me, I want to say today that data, it's power, right? The data that we are generating, all the knowledge that we are generating, because I'm going to these communities, I'm talking with the people, they are telling me, hey, what happened if you mix amaranth leaves with African nightshade and a spider plant? There are changes in nutrition, and I'm working on that, right? To understand what happened with that, how can I use that information to promote the news? But it's traditional data, it's traditional knowledge that I am using, and then I have to really be thinking about how we can think about these crops as culturally relevant, as important for the community. So I really loved your idea of not thinking about these crops just as traits, agronomical traits that we need to improve to produce more, but like a whole amount of knowledge, cultural relevance that we can empower using data, using all these efforts and research that we are doing right now. So just to close, because I really think that it's important to start the discussion after all these amazing insights, I wanted to say that this news promotion should be linked to all the different actors of the value chain that Celine just mentioned, but we also need to generate the evidence, right? To say why this news should be included in all these policy changes in dietary guidelines. And this is actually, for me, a prerequisite to transform food systems. We cannot transform if we don't know what is this, if we don't know it. But once we generated the knowledge, we have to do it at the same time are in partnership with the different communities. So that's the comment that I want to do today. It was really amazing. I have so many ideas to share with you, and happy to continue this conversation, and I pass it to you. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you, Emma, Celine, and Jenny, for this incredible presentation and overview of the nuances of NUS, including the governance, challenges of scaling, seed sovereignty, and the importance of expanded food composition data for both people and planet. One theme that emerged during this webinar, as well as other webinars, is that when communities lose species, they also lose agency and power. And so empowering people and communities is a really powerful insight that I'm taking away from this, and frankly, a necessity as we consider how to build more resilient, diverse, nutritious, and ultimately sovereign food systems. So I want to turn over to our Q&A portion of the webinar. We probably have time for just one or two quick questions, but Jenny, you touched on this briefly, so maybe I could pass this to Emma and Celine. One question was around NUS and indigenous traditional knowledge systems. Yet much of that knowledge is with indigenous peoples and traditional knowledge systems, yet research, breeding programs, and policy advocacy are often led by scientific institutions. And so how, Celine and Emma, do you see navigating this tension, and what would it take to shift NUS agendas from being about these communities to being led by these communities?
I can start and then I'll pass it to you, Sonia. I think that there has been a number of initiatives over the last few years that are really hopeful, that focus on participatory breeding and trying to get farmers and communities into the room when we decide what kinds of traits are going to be bred into these improved varieties, so that they can be, so the breeding programs can be driven by the actual concerns of these communities, rather than sort of whatever the plant breeders and the funding agencies that sometimes impact the priorities, so that we can kind of shift who drives those processes. I think that those kinds of spaces are hopeful. And I think that we'll touch on that in a future webinar on seeds as well. We'll probably learn a lot more about that. Selena, do you have anything to add?
So just giving one example, something we are also working, some other colleagues are working on in the same project, and Jenny and I are working on is a methodology whereby like a lot of different varieties, existing varieties, are collected either from the gene bank and also from local communities, etc., and whereby farmers are being given like 3 varieties each, but they don't know what it is. And so they can rank them according to their own priorities. So before the experiment, they all sit together and they say, for us, it's important that so and so and so characteristics. And then they each get like 3 varieties. They try them in the local conditions, because that's another thing with breeding. No, they're also, these things are bred in perfect conditions. Well, what a farmer is doing is not perfect. And so they test them in their own fields, and then they rank them, etc., And then there's a whole methodology and digital tools behind for then actually the scientists to be able to see which one was most preferred. And in terms of like wheat varieties in Ethiopia, it was actually an existing variety that was just preferred, and then later on was able to be also spread. But then still other people said, oh, why did the one I ranked high did not come out? Is because it's often also very dependent on the type of soil or the climate or the region where you work. So really experimenting basically with that diversity and trying to consider as many as possible and evaluate you through the eyes of the farmers, etc. Yes, there are a number of methodologies that exist and that can still be like improved on, etc.
Excellent. Thank you. We have time for just maybe one quick 1-minute question. And Jenny, I don't want to leave you out, so I have a question for you. What about the role of news as forage goods? Is there anyone working in this space around using forage in US to improve livestock? I had the luxury of visiting you in Cali, Colombia, so that's why I'm picking on you, because I know you guys are working on this. If you could answer in 1 minute, then we'll wrap it up. Thank you.
Yeah, definitely. Well, we have a huge gene bank collection in Cali, in Colombia, including so many forages, and they are amazing. We are just evaluating diversity of these plants in different ways, to not only for nutrition but also for environmental impact. So we are working also on different new species that can be included as part of the diet for generating a lower methane emissions, so that means lower environmental impact. So definitely that's something that we have to talk about. And it's amazing because we can think about forages to use like part of the system. So again, it's thinking about this systemic thinking, right? Like how we can try to take advantage of all the different aspects of the diversity that we have.
Excellent. Yeah, thank you, Jenny. And thank you to all the presenters for sharing such valuable and novel insights. And thank you all for joining. As mentioned, the published policy brief is available for reading. The link is in the chat. Our next webinar will be on Wednesday, May 6th at the same time. It will be focused on seeds and power, so very complementary to this webinar. Please feel free to scan the QR code or click the link in the emails that you received to sign up for the next series. And I just want to close saying that if today showed us anything, it's that the future of food belongs to all of us, and so does the power to change it. So thank you all so much for joining, and we hope to see you at the next webinar.